about. And Jesus had no problem destroying their argument whatsoever. So no doubt what happened was they saw that these distinguished leaders were beaten down by Jesus and they couldn't argue again. So they sent even more prominent people, even more people that are learned in the oral traditions. And they can go and confront them. So they would send these men to confront Jesus. And it doesn't take them very, very long to find fault with what Jesus and his disciples were doing. Immediately, they see the disciples sitting there eating without washing their hands. You know, we'll go into this in more detail in the next verse. But what we have to be clear about here is it's not talking about them being filthy. You don't wash your hands before you eat. It's not talking about that. This is not talking about hygiene. This is talking about being ceremonially. It's about ceremony, that the customs that they had to perform before they would eat. And that's what they're talking about here. Now, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law hated Jesus and his disciples because they didn't comply with their man. And we need to be clear about their man-made rules and regulations. Jesus was seen as being a bad influence on the people. For not only did Jesus not adhere to their petty rules and regulations, he was teaching his disciples that they didn't need to do it either. So you can see the conflict these people are going to go in, why they hated Jesus so much. In verses 3 to 5, the Pharisees and all the Jews did not eat unless they gave their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the traditions of the elders. When they came back from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And they observe many other traditions, such as the washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. So the Pharisees and teachers of the law asked Jesus, why don't your disciples live according to the traditions of the elders instead of eating their food with defiled hands? You know, when it came to hand washing, the Pharisees had it down to a fine, fine art. And remember, this is not about hygiene. This is about being ceremonially clean. The water for washing had to be kept in a special beaker, a special place, a special probably a big jar that they had, and they had to make sure it was covered so that no dust or anything could get into it or could penetrate it. So it would become unclean. And what they would do, first of all, they would get their fingers and they would put their hands up and they would pour water on it. Or someone else would pour water on it. And what they would do, it would just, see, when I say pour water, I'm talking about an egg cup full of water. We're not talking about a great deal of water. It's not water that you're going to use to wash your hands. This is just water that would pour down until it reached the wrist. And they would pour it down. And then what they would do is they would get their fist and they would match it into their hand and they'd go like that. But of course, what happens when you do that is because that water has touched your hands, it therefore becomes unclean. Are you still with me? Mm-hmm. Right? It's because they've washed it and they put their hands in it, they've made the water unclean. So what they used to do, instead of doing that, after they'd done that, they would then go like that. Or it could have been like that. Sorry. I couldn't resist it. But they would then put their hands down like that. And then what they would do, they would get the water again, they'd get the same amount of water and they would pour it over it so that it would drip down, so that you were ceremonially, that made you ceremonially clean then, because you haven't touched anything else. And then what happened was, when you've gone through all that rigmarole, you might think that's it. But I hate to tell you, that wasn't just for at the beginning of a meal. That was between every single course. So every course you went through, you had to go through the same kind of ritual. And that's how stupid it had become. They had made all these petty rules and regulations that were tying people up in knots, that they had to do this, they had to be able to, if you didn't do that, heretic. It's just amazing what they went through. And we need to be clear. There are principles laid down for ceremonial cleaning in the Old Testament, where it required the priests to wash their hands before they entered the holy place to offer their sacrifice. But we need to be clear here. There is no scripture whatsoever that commands ordinary people to go through a ritual for cleansing before they eat bread. There are just man-made rules and regulations, not God's. And it's these that Jesus refused to comply with. When we read on the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew's Gospel, it looks as though Jesus is contradicting the law of God. For he says, "You have heard it said, you shall love your neighbour and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you." And you think, well, he's clearly contradicting that. But it's not. Because what we have to understand is that to a Jew, when it said it was written, and we need to be clear, when it is written, that means it was written in Scripture itself. But what does Jesus say? Jesus says, you have heard it said. So what he's alluding to is to this oral teaching that they've been given from the scribes and the Pharisees. So it's not Scripture, it's just oral tradition that's being passed down to them. Jesus wasn't contradicting Scripture. He was contradicting the oral traditions that had been handed down. Jesus never criticized or disobeyed the written word. But everywhere he went, he seemed to violate their oral traditions. Now, a Pharisee believed that they could be saved by keeping themselves clean, by keeping all these petty rules and regulations about cleanliness. And they even had different levels of cleanliness, as it were, for ceremonial washing of hands. Now, they had a tier, as it were. Because, you know, it's like to purify themselves even more. If they went to the marketplace, now they would probably come into contact with say for instance, a Gentile like us. And they'd come in and they would see us, and if they touched us in any way, they become unclean. Because we are unclean. Not because we don't have a wash, that's not what it said. Okay? But if they touch us, they become unclean. So what they did, when they went to the marketplace, when they would come home, they would have to immerse themselves fully in water. So can you imagine every time you went down the shop, you had to come home and you had to bath? What it would be like? It was crazy what they were asking these people to do. And these are just some of the illustration Mark tells us. There were many other traditions around how to wash a cup. You had to wash it. I won't even go into them because we'd be here all day. You know, how to wash the pitchers, how to wash the kettle. The ways they've broken it down so that everything you ought to do in a set rules, set way. All these petty rules and regulations begin described as bureaucracy gone mad. Throughout history, people who seek power have always begun by slowly chipping away at people's freedoms until they get the power to control them. And the Pharisees were no different. They wrote a policy about the law that would then make it a regulation. First of all, it's just a law, but then it becomes a regulation, and then it becomes binding on your heart. You have to do that, and if you don't do this law, you're a heretic. And it's about power. It's about controlling people, and that's what they were doing. God is concerned about not breaking our traditions, but He is concerned about us breaking His law, what's written in His Word. You know, this is not something new, for we find the danger of legalism prevalent in the church today. You know, I used to go to a church And if you raised your hand, they thought you wanted to go to the toilet. Thankfully, it's not like that anymore. And you certainly wouldn't want to go late there because, they'd all be talking about you, like sort of, then you don't, you don't want that. Oh, late, how dishonoring is that to God? And I remember once, I'm sure I've told you this, but I was going to church and I was late and I was legging it, I was running up the road, that's when I could run, by the way, and I was running up the road, and there was this old lady, carrying these two bags, dodging like sort of thing, and I run straight past her. And God said to me, what are you doing? And Lord, I'm late for church, I need to get to church on time, and I'm legging it like sort of thing. He said, what's the most important thing? Helping that old lady or going to church, being late for church? And of course, needless to say, I went back and carried the old woman's bag for her and was late for church. But the point I'm trying to make here is we can become concerned more about tradition, more about what other people think about us, than we are about doing what is right, what is needed. And we don't do things because we're worried that people might say something or people might talk about us. So it prevents us from doing what God has told us to do in His Word.